Come home to finalize some details, my mother said 1 month before the wedding. I walked in to find my fiancé pressed against my older sister, her hand resting on a pregnant belly. My parents sat waiting like a jury with a pre-written verdict. 5 years later, with their golden child comatose, they finally remembered I existed. I am not returning to save them. I am coming back to drag every secret into the light. My name is Chloe Robinson. I am 30 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the designated anchor of my family. By day, I work as a contract compliance manager at Halewood Benefits Group, a massive corporate firm right here in Columbus, Ohio. My job is entirely about reading the fine print, identifying hidden risks, and ensuring that every single party aligns perfectly with the agreed terms. I am paid a very good salary to look at a seemingly perfect document and find the trapdoors. It is a fitting career for someone who has spent her entire life managing expectations, predicting disasters, and keeping things running smoothly. I am the stable one, the disciplined one, the daughter who makes a solid income, pays her bills on time, keeps her head down, and never causes a scene. In the Robinson household, being called the most reliable person is simply a polite, sanitized way of saying you are the one expected to handle the fallout and sweep up the mess without complaining. For the past 3 years, my center of gravity had been Willa Mercer. Willa was a branding specialist for high-end bridal fashion studios. She spent her days curating beauty, organizing aesthetic mood boards, and selling the grand, expensive concept of perfect, eternal love. Perhaps that was exactly why everyone in our social circle considered us the absolute perfect couple. We balanced each other out in ways that felt mathematically correct, where I was spreadsheets, risk assessments, and rigid schedules. Willa was silk fabrics, soft ambient lighting, and spontaneous laughter in the kitchen at midnight. We had built a life together that looked entirely flawless from the outside, and I truly believed it was flawless on the inside, too. We were just 1 month away from our wedding day. The invitations were already sent out. The caterer was paid in full, and the historic downtown venue was locked down. My dress was hanging in a protective bag in the guest room closet. Because Willa and I were both meticulous planners, we had already started mapping out our next major chapter long before the wedding invitations went out. We wanted children, a family of our own, built on our own terms. To get a head start on the complicated logistics, we scheduled an initial consultation at Larkhaven Reproductive Center to explore the best fertility pathways and timelines for a same-sex female couple. It made complete logical sense to go there, but it also came with a heavy, suffocating layer of irony, because the primary director and founder of Larkhaven Reproductive Center was none other than Reagan Robinson. Reagan is my older sister by exactly 6 years. She is a highly successful, fiercely charismatic, and razor-sharp fertility specialist. She is featured in local magazines. She gives keynote speeches at medical conferences. More importantly, she is the absolute, untouchable pride and joy of our parents. From the exact moment she was born, Reagan was the blazing sun, and the rest of us were just insignificant planetary bodies caught helplessly in her gravitational pull. Growing up, Reagan operated under an entirely different set of rules than I did. She was always instantly forgiven before she even had the chance to form an apology. If she broke an expensive vase, it was somehow the fault of whoever placed it too close to the edge of the table. If she missed a crucial deadline, the school system was fundamentally flawed. If she hurt someone, they were simply being too sensitive. Meanwhile, I was quietly conditioned to be the understanding one. I was the child who yielded, the sister who stepped back into the shadows, the daughter who silently swept up the broken glass so no one else would step on it. Going to her clinic was supposed to be an olive branch, a mature way to include my complicated family in our beautiful future. It turned out to be the exact opposite. As the wedding date drew closer, an uncomfortable, buzzing static began to hum beneath the surface of my perfectly organized life. Small, strange details started stacking up, little inconsistencies that my compliance-oriented brain registered but my hopeful heart actively chose to ignore. Willa began avoiding my gaze. It was subtle at first. When we sat on the couch together at night to watch television, she would angle her body just slightly away from mine. She became perpetually engrossed in her phone, her responses shrinking down to short, distracted hums. She stopped asking about my day. Then there was Reagan. My sister suddenly became overly invested in the highly private details of our lives. Reagan, who usually only cared about the profit margins of her clinic and her exclusive country club memberships, was suddenly showing up at our shared townhouse completely unannounced. She had strong opinions on the catering menu. She had opinions on the honeymoon destination. She would sit in our kitchen, drinking our coffee, looking at Willa with an intensity that I brushed off as mere familial bonding. Worse than Reagan's sudden presence, my mother abruptly developed an intense, almost frantic interest in our family planning timeline. "Are you absolutely sure you want to wait a whole year after the wedding to start the fertility treatments?" my mother asked me over lunch one Sunday, her eyes darting nervously around the restaurant. "Sometimes these medical procedures take a lot of time. You should really lock down a donor and a rigid schedule right now. Do not delay these things. Chloe." I dismissed all of it. I categorized it as standard pre-wedding jitters. I told myself Willa was just exhausted and stressed about the bridal studio timelines at work. I reasoned that my mother and sister were finally, after 30 years, showing a genuine, loving interest in my personal life. I had spent 3 decades smoothing over the rough, sharp edges of my family dynamics, and I was deeply, tragically practiced at convincing myself that everything was perfectly fine. I was the designated keeper of the peace. I had to keep the peace, even if it meant ignoring the smoke seeping out from under the door. Then came a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my office desk, reviewing a dense, 70-page vendor agreement for a corporate client, when my personal cell phone rang. It was my mother. "Chloe," she said the second I answered. Her voice was completely devoid of its usual high-pitched, dramatic cadence. It was flat, measured, and strangely calm. It was a terrifying kind of calm. "I need you to come over to the house tonight, straight from work. Do not go home first. There is an urgent matter regarding the wedding that we need to discuss." "What kind of matter?" I asked, a sudden, freezing chill settling deep into the base of my neck. "Is it the venue? Did the final deposit not clear the bank?" "Just come to the house. Chloe, we will talk when you get here." She hung up immediately. I sat there and stared at the dark screen of my phone for a full minute. My rational brain tried to categorize the exact tone of her voice. It was not the tone of a mother worried about a floral arrangement. It was the tone of someone who had prepared a heavily rehearsed script. I packed up my leather briefcase, left the corporate office at 5 o'clock sharp, and drove across town. The evening air was thick and humid, sticking to the windshield of my car as I pulled into my parents' long driveway. Willa's compact car was already parked there. Reagan's massive luxury SUV was parked right beside it, taking up the center space. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door and walked slowly down the familiar hallway into the living room. The silence in the house was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating. I turned the corner and stopped dead in my tracks, my briefcase suddenly feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. My parents were seated side by side in their matching floral armchairs. Their postures were stiff, their hands perfectly folded in their laps. They looked exactly like a formal tribunal waiting patiently to deliver a catastrophic verdict. But my eyes bypassed my parents entirely and landed squarely on the center sofa. Willa was sitting there, my beautiful fiancée. The woman I was supposed to marry and pledge my life to in exactly 30 days. She was not looking at me. She was staring firmly and silently at the wooden coffee table. Sitting pressed right up against her, shoulders touching, thigh to thigh, was my older sister, Reagan. That visual alone would have been enough to stop my heart in my chest. But it was the precise placement of their hands that broke my entire world into jagged, unfixable pieces. Willa had one hand resting gently, protectively, on the lower curve of her stomach, and Reagan had her right hand placed firmly right on top of Willa's. It was an unmistakable, deeply intimate, fiercely possessive gesture. It was the universal, undeniable posture of expecting parents protecting their child. Nobody moved. The air in the room stood entirely still. They had arranged this scene. They had set the stage, practiced their lines together, and waited comfortably for me to walk blindly into the slaughter. The realization hit me with the crushing force of a physical blow to the ribs. I was not brought here to discuss flower arrangements, seating charts, or catering menus. I was brought here to be formally informed that my future, my partner, and my entire life no longer belonged to me. I did not sit down. My body flatly refused the invitation of the empty armchair positioned directly across from the sofa. From where I stood, the entire room felt like a perfectly staged theater set, but my eyes zeroed in on a single prop placed deliberately on the mahogany coffee table. It was a thick manila medical file, Nilla, even from 6 feet away. I could read the bold, black marker printed on the top right corner tab. It bore my initials alongside a string of clinic identification digits. The logo for Larkhaven Reproductive Center was stamped squarely in the center. My compliance manager brain, trained to scan for anomalies and unearth hidden liabilities, instantly registered that this was not a simple confession of infidelity. People who are merely sleeping together do not bring printed, tabbed medical dossiers to a breakup. This was a merger. This was a hostile takeover. Willa was the first to break the suffocating silence. She did not look at my face. She kept her eyes glued to the collar of my blouse. Her voice trembled, thin and reedy, lacking all the warm resonance I had loved for 3 years. "Chloe, I am pregnant," Willa whispered, her fingers tightening slightly against her own stomach, right beneath where Reagan's hand rested. "I am 11 weeks along, and Reagan has been the one walking alongside me in this entire process. She has been my rock." Walking alongside me in this entire process. It was a cowardly, sanitized phrase. It was the kind of corporate speak designed to blur the edges of a brutal truth. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my brain, shutting down the panic and replacing it with the absolute zero temperature of an interrogation room. "Use exact words." "Willa," I said. My voice did not shake. It sounded completely foreign to me, stripped of all affection. "Do not speak to me in vague metaphors. Tell me exactly what you mean by walking alongside you." Reagan let out a heavy, irritated sigh, as if my demand for clarity was an unreasonable burden on her schedule. She shifted her weight on the sofa, pulling her shoulders back to assert her natural, lifelong dominance over the room. "She means we are together, Chloe," Reagan stated firmly, looking me dead in the eyes without a single flicker of remorse. "Willa and I have been seeing each other for 8 months. It started shortly after your first round of fertility consultations at my clinic. We realized we had a profound connection. It was not something we planned, but it transitioned into us meeting privately. And now, we are building a life together." 8 months. That meant they had been sleeping together while Willa and I were tasting wedding cakes. They had been together while I was paying the deposits for the florist. They had been together while Willa lay in our bed, holding my hand, talking about the future. "You are pregnant," I said, directing the words back to Willa, ignoring my sister's manufactured romantic narrative. "And Reagan is a woman. So, unless biology has radically changed since this morning, there is a missing variable here. Explain the medical file on the table." Reagan's jaw tightened. "I facilitated the insemination process at Larkhaven," she said, her tone shifting to the clinical, detached cadence she used with her patients. "We used a private donor. I arranged the entire protocol through my center. It was the safest, most efficient way to ensure Willa had a successful conception." The breath physically left my lungs, though I did not let my face show it. This was the fatal blow. They had not just stolen my relationship, they had hijacked the exact blueprint of my future. They had taken the meticulous, loving plans Willa and I had made for our family and executed them behind my back. Willa finally looked up, her eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. as if she expected me to offer her comfort for the guilt she was feeling. "Chloe, please understand. I used the notebook. The blue leather notebook we kept in the nightstand. The one where we wrote down all the traits we wanted in a sperm donor. I brought it to Reagan. We used those exact notes to select the donor for this baby. I just wanted the life we talked about, but I realized I wanted it with her. I am so sorry, but this is my new life now." I stared at her, absorbing the absolute, grotesque cruelty of that admission. She had used our shared, intimate dreams as a shopping list for her betrayal. I waited for the gasp. I waited for my parents to intervene, to express horror, to demand that Reagan and Willa leave the house for what they had done. I waited for the family loyalty I had spent 30 years earning. Instead, my mother, Judith, smoothed the fabric of her floral skirt and cleared her throat. She looked at me not with sympathy, but with mild, bureaucratic impatience. "Well, obviously, the wedding is canceled," my mother announced. She spoke as if she were rescheduling a minor dental appointment. "The catering and the venue will need to be handled, but you can deal with the refunds. The reality is, Chloe, there is a baby involved now, an innocent child. You are 30 years old. You need to handle this with grace and act like a mature adult." "Act like a mature adult," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Yes," my mother insisted, her voice growing sharper, leaning forward in her chair. "Reagan has a massive reputation in this city. Larkhaven is expanding. The clinic needs absolute stability right now. A messy, public scandal regarding a canceled wedding and a stolen fiancé would be catastrophic for her brand. You need to tell your friends that the breakup was mutual and amicable. We cannot have people digging into the timeline of this pregnancy. You must keep this quiet." They had known. The realization clicked into place with the heavy finality of a bank vault locking. My parents had not been ambushed by this news today. They had been briefed. They had weighed the scales of their two daughters, and they had chosen the golden child, as they always did. They had aligned themselves with the betrayers before I even pulled my car into the driveway. My pain was merely a public relations obstacle they needed to manage. I felt a strange, floating sensation, a severe detachment from my own body, but my vision remained incredibly sharp. I took 2 slow steps toward the coffee table. Nobody stopped me. I looked down at the manila folder. The top flap was slightly open, revealing the first page of a standard Larkhaven Clinic consent and liability waiver for reproductive services. My eyes locked onto the bottom right corner of the page. There, sitting on the line designated for the patient's partner, was a signature. It was my name, Chloe Robinson, but the ink was pressed too hard into the paper, and the looping curve of the letter C was frantic and rushed, lacking my usual measured precision. It was a forgery. A clumsy, desperate forgery on a legally binding medical document. I pointed a single finger at the paper. "Who signed my name to this insurance and consent form?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, losing all its previous warmth. The confident veneer in the rooms instantly cracked. Willa physically flinched, pulling her hand back from her stomach. Reagan's arrogant posture stiffened, her eyes darting quickly toward our father, who had remained entirely silent up until this moment. My mother suddenly found the pattern of the living room rug fascinating. They all rigidly avoided looking at the document. The silence was not just guilty, it was terrified. They knew exactly what I was looking at. I did not need them to confess to the forgery out loud. Their collective, panicked silence was a full admission of guilt. They had used my identity to push the paperwork through the clinic's system. They had used me. I did not scream. I did not throw the glass vase sitting on the side table. I did not fall to my knees and weep for the woman I loved or the family I thought I belonged to. I simply picked up my leather briefcase, my fingers gripping the handle with bone-white intensity. I looked at Willa, who was now quietly sobbing into her hands. I looked at Reagan, whose jaw was clenched in defensive defiance. Finally, I looked directly at my parents, who were watching me with a sickening mixture of relief and expectation. waiting for me to absorb the blow and walk away quietly, just as I had always done. "Today, you did not make me disappear," I said, my voice sliced through the heavy air of the living room, cold and utterly final, bringing every tear and breath in the space to a dead halt. "You merely just taught me that I no longer have a family." I turned my back on them, walked out the front door, and let it click shut behind me. I drove back to the shared townhouse in absolute silence. When I pushed the front door open, the space did not feel like a fractured home or a mourning ground for a lost relationship. It felt exactly like the scene of a meticulously planned identity theft. Every velvet throw pillow, every framed photograph on the mantel, every piece of expensive shared furniture looked like evidence left behind by con artists who had finally skipped town. I did not sit on the edge of the mattress we had bought together and cry. I walked straight into the home office, flicked on the glaring overhead light, and went directly to work. I pulled every file folder from the heavy metal cabinet and spread them across the hardwood floor. I used my phone to photograph every single financial document, every joint bank statement, every shared utility bill, and every digital calendar appointment I could access. I paid special, hyper-focused attention to anything bearing the letterhead of my sister's medical practice or related to the insurance claims. I screenshotted months of text messages, archiving the timeline of my own deception, saving the mundane conversations about grocery lists that had occurred at the exact same time my future was being sold out from under me. I compiled it all into a secure, encrypted cloud folder. I was building a failsafe, not a memory box. I knew the kind of people I was dealing with. By midnight, I began the execution phase of my exit. Instead of making hysterical phone calls or demanding closure from people fundamentally incapable of giving it, I handled my life with the cold, calculated precision of a corporate liquidator. I logged into our banking portals and froze the joint credit cards, cutting off the authorized user access immediately. I transferred my exact half of the liquid funds into a brand new, private account at an entirely different banking institution. I logged into the security application on my phone and changed the digital keypad code on the front door, revoking all previous access logs. I drafted a master email to the wedding caterer, the venue coordinator, and the florist. The message was identical, brief, and completely devoid of emotion. The wedding is permanently canceled. Liquidate the contracts immediately. Route exactly 50% of all eligible refunds directly to the routing number attached to this email. Any remaining financial obligations or cancellation fees belong entirely to the other party. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I walked into my office in Columbus and handed my resignation to the Vice President of Human Resources. I did not give a standard 2-week notice. I cited a severe, immediate family emergency, packed my desk into a single cardboard box, and left the building before noon. Over the next 72 hours, I sold nearly everything I owned that could not fit into the trunk and back seat of my sedan. I sold the expensive dining table to a neighbor. I dropped the designer clothes at a consignment shop. I did not care about the resale value or the financial loss. I only cared about the speed of my extraction. I wanted to be a ghost before they even realized the house was empty. I called a former mentor, a sharp, no-nonsense executive who had recently taken over a division at Northlane Risk Systems down in Raleigh, North Carolina. She had always praised my absolute refusal to compromise under pressure and my ability to read the hidden traps in complex paperwork. I asked if she had any openings in her department. She offered me a desk before the phone call even ended. Before I crossed the state line, I initiated a total digital blackout. I blocked my parents, my sister, and my former fiancé across every single cellular network. I deactivated every social media profile, erasing thousands of photographs and connections. I abandoned my personal email address and created a new one, entirely disconnected from my past. I systematically cut ties with every mutual friend, every casual acquaintance, and every colleague who had even a tangential connection to my old family. I knew they would eventually hear the sanitized, carefully constructed narrative my mother and sister were spinning back in Ohio. They would paint me as the unstable one who fled. I did not care. Defending my reputation to them would require staying engaged in the war, and I had already decided to simply walk off the battlefield entirely. The first 2 years in North Carolina were completely dedicated to reconstruction. I committed to intensive, weekly therapy, but not to weep over a broken engagement or a lost sister. I went to a highly recommended clinical psychologist to aggressively dissect my own foundational conditioning. I needed to understand the exact mechanics of why I had been trained, since childhood, to act as the emotional shock absorber for a deeply dysfunctional family system. I learned how to identify the subtle, insidious ways I had been taught to view my own boundaries as an inconvenience to others. I treated my mind like a compromised contract, searching for the bad clauses, striking them out aloud in that therapy room, and rewriting the terms of my own existence. I learned that my empathy had been weaponized against me, used as a tool to keep me compliant while others took what they wanted. That psychological autopsy fundamentally changed my professional trajectory. I transitioned away from standard contract compliance and pivoted directly into corporate violation management. I became an expert at stepping into active disasters, identifying the liable parties, and ruthlessly containing the financial and legal damage. I did not panic when the stakes were high. Eventually, I climbed the corporate ladder to become the Director of Crisis Compliance at Northline. It was a high-stakes, demanding position practically born from the exact trauma I had survived. I was the person powerful executives called when things completely fell apart, because I had already lived through a total structural collapse and learned how to build an impenetrable fortress from the debris. By my 5th year in Raleigh, my reality was entirely unrecognizable from the life I had left behind in the Midwest. I owned a bright, spacious apartment overlooking the city skyline, purchased entirely on my own credit. My annual income was nearly 3 times what I had made back in Ohio. I was surrounded by a team of highly competent professionals who respected my intellect and my strategic boundaries. Rather than expecting me to constantly clean up their manufactured messes, more importantly, I had allowed someone new into my life. Her name was Tessa Grady. She was a landscape architect who spent her days designing sustainable, deeply rooted environments that could weather harsh seasons. Our relationship was nothing like the frantic, aesthetically obsessed, performative dynamic I had shared in my past. It was slow, quiet, and fundamentally secure. Tessa never asked me to shrink myself to make her feel bigger. She never asked me to perform the role of the perfect, understanding partner. She listened to the stark facts of my past without pity, offering only a steady, unwavering respect for the life I had built in the aftermath. She just wanted me exactly as I was, sharp edges, guarded instincts, and all. But the most profound source of my strength, the ultimate proof that I had truly won the silent war, was not the executive title, the money in the bank, or the peace of my new apartment. It was a stark, undeniable absence. For 5 long, consecutive years, I had not received a single text message, a forwarded letter, or a blocked voicemail attempting to offer an apology. My family had maintained absolute silence, comfortably living inside the lie they had built on my back. They had taken my silence as permission to forget me, and somewhere around the 4th year, I realized that the silence no longer burned. The total lack of an apology had completely stopped hurting. It had simply become the quiet, peaceful background noise of my successful survival. I had not disappeared to concede defeat to them. I had disappeared so I could finally begin to live. It was a quiet Thursday evening. Tessa was out of town attending a sustainability conference in Denver, and I was standing alone in my kitchen, pouring a single glass of red wine. The apartment was entirely peaceful, filled only with the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled sounds of the Raleigh city traffic below. I had just set the wine bottle down on the granite counter when my cell phone vibrated violently against the stone. I glanced at the illuminated screen. It was an unknown number, but the area code belonged to Central Ohio. For 60 unbroken months, That specific three-digit sequence had been completely exiled from my life. A sharp, icy instinct flared at the base of my skull, a primal warning system screaming at me to swipe the screen and send the call into the digital void. I almost did. I hovered my thumb over the red icon for 5 agonizing seconds, but the crisis manager inside me, the professional who dealt with unavoidable disasters for a living, knew that ignoring a breach never actually sealed it. A locked door rattling in the dark is far more terrifying than simply flipping on the porch light to see who is standing there. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited. Chloe. A voice rasped through the speaker. It was my mother. Judith. The syllables of my name sounded heavier in her mouth than I remembered. Her voice was noticeably older, distinctly frayed at the edges, and layered heavy with exhaustion. Yet, buried just beneath that fragile surface, I could still detect the unmistakable, hardened steel of her old, authoritative entitlement. It was the precise tone she always used when she was about to assign me a task she had no right to ask of me. My stomach tightened, but my heart rate remained completely flat. She was not calling to offer a late apology. She was calling because she needed something extracted from me. "Speak," I said, my voice completely devoid of any familial warmth. Judith inhaled sharply, clearly taken aback by the absolute zero temperature of my response. But she pushed forward with her prepared script. "There has been an accident. 3 weeks ago, Reagan was driving back from a charity gala downtown. Another driver ran a red light. It was a catastrophic collision. She is currently in the intensive care unit. Chloe. She has been in a deep coma for 21 days. The neurologists are completely uncertain if she will ever wake up, even if she does regain consciousness. They are warning us to prepare for severe, permanent neurological damage. She might never be the same person again." I stood perfectly still in my kitchen. The golden child, the untouchable son of the Robinson family, had been violently knocked out of the sky. I searched my chest for a surge of panic, a wave of profound sorrow, or even a sudden, ugly spike of vindictive joy. I found absolutely nothing. There was only a vast, hollow quiet. "I am listening," I replied simply. My lack of emotional collapse forced Judith to stumble. She quickly pivoted, accelerating her narrative to throw more tragedies at the wall. Hoping one would finally break my composure. "Things are falling apart here," Judith continued, her voice escalating into a frantic, pleading pitch. "Your father suffered a mild stroke 2 months ago. He is physically recovering, but he cannot handle stress. Willa is completely overwhelmed. She is living in a house in the suburbs with Maisie. The little girl is 4 years old now. Willa's bridal business is tanking because she cannot focus, and she is drowning in a sea of massive medical bills and legal paperwork. I am exhausted. Chloe, I am practically living at the hospital. I cannot carry everything alone anymore." I took a slow sip of my wine. The architecture of her manipulation was breathtakingly transparent. She was presenting a carefully curated gallery of victims: a comatose sister, a frail father, a struggling single mother, an innocent 4-year-old child. She was desperately trying to locate the old version of me, the compliant daughter who would instantly drop everything to play the designated martyr. "What exactly are you asking for?" "Judith," I asked, using her first name to establish the boundary of a stranger. "Just come home for a few weeks," she pleaded. At first, she attempted to package the request as a modest, temporary favor. "Just take a short leave of absence from your job. Come back to Columbus. Help me sort through these towering stacks of insurance claims. Help Willa stabilize the daily routine for the baby. We just need your organizational skills to get us through this initial nightmare." But Judith had never possessed the discipline to hide her true demands for long. Within 3 minutes of the conversation, the polite mask slipped entirely, and the sheer, staggering audacity of her actual agenda spilled out into the open. "Actually, the board of directors at Larkhaven is panicking," she rambled, her tone shifting from a grieving mother to a calculating manager. They need an interim director to step in and handle the compliance audits immediately, or the bank might freeze the operational accounts. You know how to do that. You could temporarily manage the clinic. And Willa has a spare bedroom at her house. It would be entirely logical for you to stay there. You could help with the mortgage payments, support Willa emotionally, and finally be near Maisie like a real relative. She needs family right now. Chloe, we all do. I set my wine glass down. The sheer disrespect of the proposal practically vibrated through the floorboards. They wanted me to pack up my peaceful, successful life, move back to the city that broke me, and actively manage the very fertility clinic where my own future was forged and stolen. Worse, they expected me to move into a house with the woman who betrayed me and financially support the child born from that exact betrayal. They did not want a daughter. They wanted an unpaid crisis manager and a convenient checkbook. Let me ensure I understand this correctly, I said, my voice dropping into the smooth, lethal cadence I use during hostile corporate negotiations. For 5 entire years, you have maintained absolute, unbroken silence. Not a single holiday card, not a single phone call. But now, when your golden child is incapacitated and your carefully constructed lives are collapsing under the weight of your own decisions, you suddenly remember my phone number. You want me to run the business that facilitated my ruin and play a supporting role in Willa's tragic new reality. How can you be so incredibly cold? Judith snapped, the pleading instantly vanishing, replaced by vicious, familiar indignation. This is about family. This is about shared blood. There is an innocent 4-year-old girl who has nothing to do with what happened between you and Willa. You are punishing a child for the mistakes of adults. And furthermore, if you turn your back on us now, your father and I will have to seriously reconsider the future division of the estate and our assets. She played the guilt card. She played the innocent baby card. She played the inheritance card. It was a pathetic, predictable hand. 5 years ago, the threat of losing my family's approval would have crushed me. Tonight, it felt like watching a toddler threaten to hold their breath until they got a toy. Keep the estate. Judith, I said. The word fell from my lips with the heavy final thud of a vault door locking. I do not want your money. I do not want your clinic. And I absolutely do not want your family. My answer is no. Chloe, wait. You have to... I pressed the red button. The call disconnected, severing the connection instantly. The apartment plunged back into total, beautiful silence. I exhaled a long breath, slightly surprised by my own physical reaction. My hands were not shaking. I did not feel the urge to cry. I felt an incredible, powerful sense of absolute closure. I had stared directly into the eyes of the ghost that used to haunt me, and I had simply closed the door in its face. I went to bed that night feeling victorious, believing the past had finally been permanently defeated. But I was wrong. The phone call was not a desperate plea for a family reunion. It was a panicked distraction. At exactly 10 o'clock the following morning, I was sitting at my office desk in downtown Raleigh, reviewing a risk assessment portfolio, when the receptionist buzzed my line. A courier was waiting in the lobby requiring my direct signature. I walked out to the reception area and signed the digital pad. The courier handed me a thick, stiff cardboard envelope sent via certified, priority mail. I carried the envelope back to my office, locked the door, and sliced the top open with a metal letter opener. I slid the heavy stack of documents out onto my desk. I only needed to read the bold, black heading on the very first page to understand that my mother had not called me to ask for my help. She had called me to gauge exactly how much of a threat I was about to become. This was not a tragedy. This was a trap. And the dirt they were trying to bury was much deeper and far more dangerous than a simple family betrayal. The letterhead stamped across the top of the heavy stack of documents belonged to a highly aggressive civil litigation firm based in Central Ohio. I did not need to read the entire packet to understand the magnitude of the threat. The bold, capitalized heading on the first page told me everything. It was a formal notice of discovery. I was being officially named as a party of interest in a massive professional misconduct and medical malpractice complaint filed against Lark Haven Reproductive Center. I turned to the second page, and the blood completely vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, crawling terror. Included in the evidentiary exhibits were high-resolution photocopies of medical consent waivers and insurance billing authorizations dated 5 years ago. The documents outlined a highly expensive, multi-stage reproductive procedure registered under 2 specific names, Willa Mercer and Chloe Robinson, at the bottom of each page, explicitly authorizing the billing of tens of thousands of dollars to my former corporate healthcare policy, was a signature. It was not a clumsy scribble this time. It was a terrifyingly accurate forgery of my handwriting. If I simply threw the envelope into the shredder and ignored the subpoena, I would not just be walking away from messy family drama. I would be walking blindly into the center of a federal investigation for insurance fraud, medical perjury, and financial conspiracy, if I failed to respond. The courts would assume the signature was legitimate. I would be held legally and financially liable. The pristine professional reputation I had spent 60 months building from absolute scratch as a crisis compliance director would be instantly and permanently obliterated. I packed the files into my leather briefcase and drove straight to Tessa. When I laid the documents out on our kitchen island under the bright pendant lights, Tessa did not reach for my hand and whisper hollow platitudes about familial loyalty. She did not tell me to be the bigger person and forgive them for their transgressions. Tessa was a builder. She understood structural integrity. She looked at the forged signatures, looked up at me, and spoke with absolute, grounding clarity. "Do not fight a legal battle with emotional guilt," Tessa said, tapping her index finger against the fraudulent insurance claim. "They are actively trying to make you the collateral damage to save their own assets. You do not owe blood a single thing when blood is trying to frame you for a felony. You fight this with a lawyer and cold, hard data." Within 24 hours, I retained Nora Bell. Nora was a razor-sharp civil litigator who specialized exclusively in medical fraud and corporate malfeasance. She possessed a terrifyingly calm demeanor and a reputation for dismantling corrupt medical boards. She reviewed the documents, narrowed her dark eyes, and immediately began drafting an aggressive defense strategy. When I finally booked my flight back to Columbus, Ohio, I was not returning as the prodigal daughter seeking emotional closure or a tearful reunion. I was returning as an active investigator entering a hostile active crime scene. I landed in the Midwest on a Tuesday afternoon. I completely ignored my mother's previous demands to stay in Willa's suburban guest room. Giving them physical proximity meant giving them leverage. Instead, I bypassed the residential neighborhoods entirely and checked into a long-term executive suite at a high-end hotel directly in the center of the downtown district. I needed neutral territory. I needed a secure war room where I could control the flow of information. The initial face-to-face meeting took place the following morning in the formal dining room of my parents' house. When I walked through the heavy front door, the air inside the home immediately turned to ice. My parents and Willa were sitting around the mahogany table, clearly expecting me to walk in alone, carrying my luggage and a subservient, compliant attitude. The collective shock that hit their faces when Nora Bell stepped into the room right behind me, carrying a sleek leather briefcase of her own, was absolute poetry. My father, Grant, gripped the edges of the table, his face flushing a deep, unhealthy red. Judith opened her mouth to speak, then snapped it shut, her eyes darting nervously toward Nora. Willa looked terrible. The radiant, glamorous aura she used to carry effortlessly had entirely evaporated. She looked hollowed out, her skin pale, her posture slumped under the crushing weight of single motherhood, mounting debts, and impending legal ruin. The woman who had proudly trampled over my life to choose her great, destined romance now looked like a prisoner of war. Yet, as our eyes met across the table, I could see the guarded flicker in her gaze. She was exhausted, but she was still holding back. She was still hoarding secrets she was not ready to surrender to me. The suffocating tension in the room was suddenly shattered by the sound of small footsteps pattering against the hardwood floor in the hallway. A little girl with blonde curls wandered into the dining room, It was Maisie. My chest tightened. A sharp, involuntary physical reaction that I fought ruthlessly to suppress. The child stopped, staring up at me with wide, curious green eyes. She was clutching a crumpled piece of paper in her small fist. It was an old photograph she had likely pulled from a forgotten drawer in her mother's bedroom. It was a picture of Willa and me, laughing together on a beach. Taken 2 years before the betrayal tore our lives apart. Maisie pointed a tiny finger at my face in the photograph, then looked up at the real me standing rigidly in the room. "Are you Aunt Chloe?" Maisie asked, her voice high and completely innocent. "Mommy said you moved far away. Why did you never come to my house to play?" The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the narrative they had fed this child hit me like a physical blow to the ribs. They had not just stolen my future. They had entirely rewritten my past. They had erased my history as Willa's partner, replaced my identity, and then casually rebranded me as the distant, neglectful aunt who simply could not be bothered to visit. I did not answer the little girl. Willa quickly pushed her chair back, scooped Maisie up into her arms, and practically fled the room, avoiding my gaze completely. Later that same afternoon, the true, venomous purpose of my invitation finally materialized. We relocated to the living room to discuss the alleged logistical issues at the clinic. Judith sat across from me on the floral sofa, poured a cup of tea, and adopted a perfectly practiced expression of maternal fatigue. She sighed heavily, reached into her designer tote bag, and pulled out a thick manila folder. She slid it smoothly across the glass coffee table, stopping the cardboard edge right in front of my hands. "Since you are here, Chloe, we just need to do a tiny bit of administrative housekeeping," my mother said, her voice dripping with artificial, breezy casualness. "With Reagan incapacitated, the medical board is running a standard routine audit on Larkhaven. There are just a few old patient intake forms and billing authorizations from a few years ago that are missing secondary signatures. The paperwork got sloppy during the transition. We just need you to sign these pages right here to clean up the records and keep the auditors happy. It will only take 2 minutes of your time." I looked down at the closed folder. Nora shifted her weight slightly in the armchair beside me. Her eyes locked on my mother like a hawk watching a field mouse. I did not need to open the folder to know exactly what was inside it. They were not routine intake forms. They were backdated consent waivers. They were fraudulent insurance authorizations. They were the exact same documents currently sitting in the discovery file of a federal lawsuit. Judith was not asking me to help manage the clinic. She was not asking me to support Willa. She was actively trying to trick me into legally validating the forged documents, cementing my absolute liability in the fraud. That was the exact moment the final, lingering illusion of my childhood shattered into microscopic dust. They had not called me home because they missed me. They had not called me home to help raise the innocent child. They had called me home because they desperately needed a legally binding signature from the only person clean enough to save them from a prison sentence. The air inside my childhood home felt incredibly thin, as if the walls themselves were quietly suffocating the space. After leaving the tense dining room, I took a slow, deliberate walk through the rest of the house. It was like watching a camera pan across a rotting, beautifully painted corpse. The physical decay was everywhere, perfectly mirroring the moral bankruptcy of the people living inside it. The heavy, antique grandfather clock that used to anchor the hallway was gone, leaving only a pale rectangle of unfaded wallpaper in its wake. The silver tea sets were missing from the glass display cabinets. A jagged crack spiderwebbed across the plaster ceiling in the den, completely ignored. On the granite kitchen island, where my mother used to arrange fresh flowers, there were now staggering, haphazard piles of paper. I casually flipped through the top layer. They were final notices, collection agency warnings, and exorbitant medical bills. They had been slowly pawning off their curated life to maintain the illusion of absolute perfection. The atmosphere at Larkhaven Reproductive Center was exponentially worse. When I walked through the sleek, frosted glass doors of my sister's clinic later that afternoon, the receptionist physically jumped. The staff moved through the pristine white hallways like terrified ghosts, avoiding eye contact and speaking in hushed, panicked whispers. I demanded temporary access to the administrative offices, a condition my father had readily agreed to, assuming it meant I was capitulating. Once inside the back room, the sheer scale of the panic became obvious. The digital server logs showed erratic, late-night login times. Several highly sensitive physical patient files were simply missing from the locked filing cabinets. The operational ledgers I reviewed were violently patched together, full of sudden transfers and hollow explanations. It looked exactly like a battlefield someone had frantically tried to hose down with bleach before the inspectors arrived. My father, Grant, finally cornered me in the clinic's narrow break room. He had apparently grown tired of the subtle manipulation tactics my mother preferred. His face was deeply lined, and he leaned heavily against the counter, stripping away the pretense. "We need your name on the board of directors. Chloe," he said, his voice flat and transactional. "The bank is threatening to call in the primary loans by the end of the month. If you step in as the interim executive, your pristine professional record will force them to back off. You give us a 90-day extension, the center survives, and we can keep the creditors away from the house." Before I could dissect the sheer audacity of his request, my mother materialized in the doorway, immediately pulling her favorite, worn-out moral shield from her arsenal. "Think of Maisie," Judith pleaded, her eyes wide and artificially moist. She repeated the phrase like a religious mantra. "The baby is entirely innocent, Chloe. An innocent child should not have to lose her home because of a financial misunderstanding. You have a duty to her." They genuinely believed that pointing to a blameless child would instantly override my self-preservation. They thought innocence was a currency they could spend to buy my infinite, unquestioning responsibility. I left the clinic and drove to the state hospital. I needed to see the architect of this ruin with my own eyes. I walked into the intensive care unit and stood at the foot of Reagan's bed. It was the first time I had laid eyes on my older sister in 5 years. The woman who had spent her entire life dominating every single room she entered, who had casually stolen my future with a confident smile, was now reduced to a motionless shape beneath a thin white blanket. A ventilator breathed for her, the rhythmic hissing and clicking of the machines filling the sterile room. I stared at her pale, unresponsive face, waiting for the familiar, burning wave of absolute hatred to wash over me. It never came. There was no rage left in my chest, no desire to scream at her. I felt only a vast, freezing distance. She was a stranger who had destroyed a past life I no longer inhabited. That evening, Willa requested a private conversation at my hotel suite. She arrived looking even more fragile than before, clutching a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, sitting on the edge of the velvet armchair. She finally surrendered a fraction of the truth she had been hoarding. It was not just about falling in love, Willa confessed, staring down at her trembling hands. "When I got pregnant, the bridal studio was failing. Reagan funneled money from the clinic's discretionary fund to help me open my own private branding firm. She paid the massive down payment on the suburban house in cash. I was trapped by the lifestyle she provided. The admission hung in the air, ugly and pathetic, their grand, destined romance. The epic love story they had used to justify destroying me was heavily subsidized by a corrupt financial system. It was an affair built on a foundation of mutual, parasitic benefit. The next morning, back at the family home, Maisie provided the final, bizarre twist to their desperate strategy. The little girl suddenly began clinging to me, while Judith fretted and Willa wept quietly in the corner. I was the only adult in the room who spoke in a normal, steady volume. I did not lie to Maisie. When she asked where her other mother was, I simply told her Reagan was very sick in the hospital. Children possess an acute radar for stability, and in a house completely drowning in frantic deception. My cold detachment felt like solid ground to her. My parents watched Maisie grab my hand, and I saw the immediate, triumphant gleam in their eyes. They thought the trap had finally snapped shut. They assumed that because the child liked me, my hardened exterior would melt, and I would effortlessly slip into the vacant role of the replacement parent and savior. I shattered their delusion instantly. "I am not moving into the guest bedroom," I announced, pulling my hand gently away from the child and standing up. "I am not sleeping under this roof, and I am absolutely not stepping into a parental role for a child I do not know. What I will do is authorize a licensed, professional childcare specialist to assist Willa for 8 hours a day. I will arrange a strict, predictable daily schedule for the baby, so she has stability. That is the absolute limit of my involvement with her." Judith gasped, clutching her chest, but I was already walking out the door. I was willing to ensure the child was safe, but I flatly refused to pay the price of my own life to do it. I returned to the clinic that night after hours. Nora had legally secured the server room, and I sat alone at Reagan's massive mahogany desk, digging through the deep, digital archives of the patient management system. I was cross-referencing the forged consent forms with the internal billing codes. At 11 o'clock, the blue glow of the monitor illuminated a hidden, deeply buried directory. I double-clicked the folder. A closed medical profile materialized on the screen. The patient name listed at the top was Chloe Robinson. The blood drained completely from my face as I checked the intake dates, the hormone treatment logs, and the final procedure timestamps. The dates matched the exact weeks of Willa's initial pregnancy 5 years ago. They had not just forged a signature on a standard insurance claim. They had officially registered me as the primary patient receiving the fertility treatments. They had stolen my medical identity, processed the pregnancy through my corporate benefits, and created a completely fabricated medical history under my name to hide the financial drain from the clinic's partners. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, the silence of the empty clinic ringing in my ears. This was no longer just a bitter family tragedy about a stolen fiancé. It was a calculated, multi-layered criminal conspiracy, and my sister had left my fingerprints all over the weapon. Nora did not play games with local technicians. She immediately flew in an independent digital forensics expert from Chicago, and we converted my downtown hotel suite into a secure command center. While the expert, a quiet man who lived entirely on black coffee, worked to clone the recovered server drives from Larkhaven Reproductive Center. I did exactly what I was trained to do. I built a comprehensive timeline. I spread the recovered donor invoices, the insurance payout records, the internal server access logs, and my personal employment calendar from 5 years ago across the large mahogany table. "I need you to look closely at these access logs and the billing codes," Nora said, her voice sharp as she slid a printed spreadsheet across the desk. They made a catastrophic administrative mistake. It took less than 48 hours of digging for the first massive structural lie to surface. I traced the specific routing numbers attached to Willa's entire reproductive journey: the donor sperm acquisition, the complex hormone therapies, the specialized private ultrasounds, and the final implantation procedures had not been paid for out of pocket by my sister or my former fiancé. They had been systematically and deliberately billed to the premium corporate healthcare policy tied directly to my employee profile at Halewood Benefits Group. Someone had hijacked my medical identity to maximize insurance coverage and completely hide the massive financial footprint of their scandal from the clinic's accounting partners. However, in their arrogance, they had left behind a fatal electronic footprint: the digital timestamp on the primary electronic consent form. The exact document bearing my perfectly forged signature was permanently logged at 2:15 in the afternoon on a Thursday. I pulled my archived travel itineraries from my old firm. During that exact hour on that specific Thursday, I was sitting in a window seat on a commercial flight descending into Charlotte, North Carolina, for a mandatory compliance seminar. My cell phone and laptop were securely in airplane mode. I was hundreds of miles away from the internal network computer in Reagan's private office, which was the exact IP address the server proved the form was generated from. It was an airtight, indisputable alibi. I could not have voluntarily participated in the process. The deeper I dug into the financial ledgers, the faster the remaining foundation of my family crumbled. I found a massive, Completely unexplainable capital injection deposited into the Larkhaven operational accounts just 6 weeks after Willa conceived. The amount was exactly $250,000. I cross-referenced the wire transfer dates with the county property records tied to my childhood home. It was a massive home equity line of credit, drawn directly against my parents' house. My father had looked me in the eye and claimed the clinic was only struggling recently. But this paper trail proved the rot had started 5 years ago. That $250,000 was never used for medical equipment or facility expansion. I tracked the outbound disbursements of those funds. A massive chunk of the money was routed as a heavily padded severance package to a former records administrator who abruptly resigned the exact same month the forged insurance claims were processed. It was a blatant, highly illegal payoff to buy silence. The most sickening detail was that the authorized signatures approving that specific transfer of hush money belonged directly to Grant and Judith Robinson. My parents had not just been passive. Helpless bystanders who chose to support Reagan after a tragic affair was exposed. They were active, willing accomplices. They knew about the financial and medical fraud from the very beginning, and they willingly mortgaged their own home to bury the evidence and protect Reagan's pristine reputation. The grand poetic narrative of Reagan's recent tragic accident shattered next. Judith had dramatically painted it as a random, catastrophic collision after a charity gala. But the internal server logs told a much darker, far more desperate story. I found a string of frantic, encrypted emails sent from Reagan's phone just 3 hours before her car wrapped around that telephone pole. She had not been driving home peacefully. She had been fleeing a collapsing empire. An internal accounting auditor had finally flagged the historical discrepancies in the insurance billings and sent Reagan a formal notice of intent to report the severe violations to the State Medical Licensing Board. Reagan had opened and read that specific email at 8 o'clock that evening. By 11 o'clock, she was speeding through a red light in a blind, terrified panic. The entire romantic tragedy they had forcefully fed me 5 years ago, the beautiful destined love story between my charismatic sister and my confused fiancé, was nothing but a calculated smokescreen. They had not simply fallen into bed together overwhelmed by passion. They had cold-bloodedly looked at the meticulous, expensive family planning blueprint Willa and I had built, decided they wanted it for themselves, and simply stole it. They attached my name to the fraudulent billing process to foot the enormous medical bill, and then they threw me out of my own house like useless surplus material once the pregnancy was safely secured. Then came the final, ultimate shock. I picked up the manila folder my mother had tried to push into my hands the previous afternoon. I read the dense legal jargon hidden deeply in the fine print of the document she had casually called a routine administrative cleanup. It was a retroactive confirmation of consent and liability assumption. If you had put your pen on that signature line, Nora said, pointing a gold pen at the bottom of the page, you would have handed them the keys to your own cell. She was entirely right. If I had blindly signed that piece of paper to appease my crying mother, I would have legally verified that I had full, prior knowledge of the insurance claims from 5 years ago. I would have willingly absorbed the criminal liability. I would have shielded Reagan from federal wire fraud charges, shielded the clinic from massive civil penalties, and firmly placed my own neck directly into the financial noose. I sat back in the heavy chair as the morning sun began to filter through the hotel suite windows. Every single piece of the twisted puzzle snapped violently into place, leaving a picture of pure, unadulterated greed. They did not summon me back to Ohio because they felt a single shred of remorse for destroying my life. They did not call me back because they desperately needed an aunt to love a 4-year-old child. They called me back because the federal auditors were closing in. The hush money had finally run out, and their invincible golden child was incapacitated in a hospital bed. They looked around the burning wreckage of their manufactured lives and realized that the daughter they betrayed and discarded 5 years ago was the only person left with a financial and professional record clean enough to absorb the blast. I was not a returning family member coming home to heal old wounds. I was just a pristine human shield they were trying to drag into the line of fire. The burner phone in my pocket buzzed at exactly 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. The text message contained only an address and a brief instruction to come alone to the back alley entrance. I parked my rental car 2 blocks away and walked through the damp, quiet streets until I reached the heavy steel door of Willa's bridal branding studio. The storefront windows facing the main avenue were completely dark, but a thin slice of yellow light spilled from beneath the rear exit. I knocked twice. The deadbolt clicked, and Willa pulled the heavy door open. She looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own ambition. The studio around us was filled with headless mannequins draped in expensive imported silk, a stark, mocking contrast to the absolute exhaustion etched deeply into her face. She led me to a small glass table in the center of the showroom. Resting exactly in the middle of the table was a battered gray metal lockbox. "Reagan gave this to me 4 months ago," Willa said, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "She told me to hide it and absolutely never open it unless everything was about to completely collapse. When the auditors showed up at Larkhaven last week, I broke the padlock." I sat down slowly, keeping my eyes locked on her face. "Why are you showing this to me, Willa?" "Because I am done being their shield," she replied, her hands trembling as she flipped the heavy lid open. Inside the box was a chaotic pile of physical evidence that completely bypassed medical negligence and landed squarely in the realm of calculated malice. There were thick stacks of printed text messages, original unredacted donor contracts, and a black digital storage drive labeled as the clinic hallway security backups. But sitting on top of the paper was a small, silver digital audio recorder. Willa did not immediately reach for the device. Instead, she sat across from me and took a deep, jagged breath. "I am not asking you to forgive me, Chloe," Willa began, meeting my gaze with a sudden, desperate clarity. "I stepped into that affair using my own 2 feet. I made the choice to betray you. I will carry that guilt until the day I die. And I will never try to push all the blame onto your sister. But there are things you do not know about how the timeline was manipulated." I remained perfectly silent, letting the heavy, suffocating air of the dark studio pull the truth out of her. "I was terrified," Willa confessed, her fingers tracing the edge of the metal box. "Reagan convinced me that you were getting cold feet. She told me you sat in her office during a private consultation and admitted you did not actually want to get married, that the idea of motherhood was suffocating you, and that you were only going through with the wedding out of obligation. She painted this picture of a future where I would be trapped with a partner who resented me and our child. She pushed the timeline for the pregnancy so aggressively because she convinced me she was rescuing me from a miserable life with you." The sheer psychological violence of that lie hit me like a physical weight. Reagan had not just seduced my partner, she had actively assassinated my character to accelerate the betrayal. By the time I realized she had completely lied to me about your intentions, I was already pregnant," Willa continued, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping her throat. "And I was already trapped. Reagan controlled every single cent of the startup capital for this studio. She put my name exclusively on the massive mortgage for the suburban house, but tied the equity to a trust she managed. When I threatened to leave her during the 2nd year, she smiled and promised to legally and financially ruin me. She said she would drag me through court, take full custody of Maisie, and leave me sleeping on the street. I traded one imaginary prison for a very real, very terrifying one." Willa reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small stack of folded, yellowed paper. She slid it across the glass table. "I tried to tell you," Willa whispered, a single tear finally spilling over her eyelashes. "During that first year you were in North Carolina, I wrote you a handwritten letter. I poured out the entire truth about the financial control and the lies. I begged you to just know the truth, even if you never spoke to me again. I also sent 2 massive emails to your old accounts. I gave the physical letter to Judith because she swore she had your forwarding address and wanted to help us find closure." I stared at the yellowed paper. "I never received a single word." "Judith intercepted them," Willa said, her voice hardening with sudden anger. "She deleted the emails using a backdoor access Reagan had to your old server, and she locked the physical letter in a desk drawer. I found it when I was packing up Grant's home office after his stroke." Your mother deliberately isolated you. She ensured you never got the full story, because if you knew Reagan was an abuser rather than just a romantic rival, you might have actually fought back. They needed you completely removed from the board. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. My own mother had stood guard at the gates of my exile, making sure I stayed completely blind in the dark. Then, Willa picked up the silver digital audio recorder. But this is why I called you here tonight. This is what Reagan left in the box. She pressed the play button. The audio was slightly muffled, recorded secretly during a heated argument inside what sounded like my parents' dining room. I immediately recognized the panicked, shrill pitch of my sister's voice. She was arguing with my father. The licensing board is demanding the original consent waivers from 5 years ago. Reagan's recorded voice hissed through the small speaker. If they run a forensic audit on the digital signatures, they are going to see the discrepancy. The entire clinic will go under. Dad, I will lose my medical license. Then came the voice of my father. Grant. It was not the voice of a confused, elderly man. It was cold, calculating, and ruthlessly pragmatic. Stop panicking, Grant's recorded voice commanded sharply. We have the perfect failsafe. We will just call Chloe. She will never come back, Reagan argued. She has not spoken to us in 60 months. You do not understand your own sister. Grant scoffed, his words dripping with absolute, sickening confidence. Chloe is completely predictable. We tell her you are dying. We tell her the baby is going to be homeless. We throw the word family at her until she cracks. We bring her back here, overwhelm her with a crisis, and slide the retroactive documents in front of her. We pull Chloe back to sign and make it look pretty. She will do it because Chloe always chooses responsibility over war. She would rather take a bullet than watch a child suffer. We just have to point the gun at the kid. The recording clicked off, plunging the studio back into a deafening silence. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat against the cool glass of the table. Hearing the betrayal was one thing. Hearing the exact clinical dissection of my own empathy being weaponized by the man who raised me was an entirely different universe of pain. They did not just think I was a compliant fool. They thought my fundamental decency was a severe character flaw they could easily exploit. They had built an entire survival strategy around the assumption that I would willingly jump on a grenade to save the people who threw it at me. I will give you the box, Willa said, breaking the quiet. She pushed the metal container toward my chest. I will hand over the backup drives. I will stand up in federal court, or in front of the medical board, or in front of the entire city, and I will testify to every single word of this. I will gladly let them put handcuffs on me for the insurance fraud I was complicit in. I am ready to be completely ruined in public. She stopped, taking a desperate breath, her eyes locking onto mine with the fierce, terrifying protective instinct of a mother cornered by wolves. I only want one thing in return. Chloe, you have to promise me that you will shield Maisie. You have to ensure that when this entire corrupt system burns to the ground, my daughter does not become collateral damage. I do not care what happens to me, and I do not care what happens to your parents or Reagan. Just protect the child from the fallout. I looked at the terrified woman sitting across from me. I looked at the metal box containing the absolute destruction of the Robinson family dynasty, the last remaining threads of the daughter I used to be, the peacemaker, the shock absorber, the reliable collateral, simply dissolved into the shadows of the room. I reached across the table and placed my hand firmly over the metal lid of the box. I accept those terms, I said, my voice resonating with a cold, terrifying authority that I had never heard in myself before. I will protect the child with every resource I possess. I will ensure her financial and emotional safety. But hear me clearly, Willa, I will not protect a single adult in this city. I stood up, pulling the heavy lockbox against my side. The investigation was officially over. From this exact second forward, the true counterattack had finally begun. I did not walk back into my childhood home the next evening as a daughter seeking a truce. I walked through the front door like a perfectly calibrated, silent explosive with a precisely set timer. I wore a tailored navy suit, carried my leather briefcase, and projected an aura of complete, exhausted surrender. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction of an inch. I let my voice soften, bleeding out the cold authority I had wielded for the past 3 days. I needed them to believe that the crushing weight of family obligation had finally broken my defenses. My parents were waiting for me in the den. My father was pouring a glass of bourbon, and my mother was nervously adjusting the cushions on the sofa, when I sat down and sighed heavily, releasing a perfectly acted breath of defeat. Their eyes instantly darted toward each other. It was a look of pure, predatory triumph. They thought they had finally won. "I have spent the last 24 hours reviewing the financial ledgers," I said, keeping my gaze lowered to the coffee table. "It is a massive disaster. But I suppose I might consider taking over the center temporarily, just to stabilize the accounts and keep the creditors at bay. I can only do this if every single piece of paperwork is meticulously organized and accounted for. I will not step into a blind liability." Their greed made them completely reckless. The mere suggestion that I was capitulating caused them to drop every single remaining defensive shield they possessed. Within 10 minutes, they laid out their entire, grotesque strategy right on the glass table. Grant leaned forward, his bourbon forgotten, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, businesslike tone. "It is actually very simple. Chloe, we have a stack of primary consent forms and insurance authorizations from the initial treatments Willa received. The auditors are threatening to flag them because the secondary partner's signatures are missing or disputed. We need you to take this pen, backdate your signature to 5 years ago, and officially confirm that you utilized your corporate healthcare benefits for the procedures. It ties up all the loose ends." "And if I do that?" I asked, feigning apprehension. "What about the administrative liability? What about the federal audit?" "You just absorb a small fraction of the administrative oversight on paper," Judith chimed in smoothly, smiling as if she were offering me a slice of cake. "It shows the board that it was a joint family venture all along. It completely clears Reagan of any malicious fraud allegations. You have a spotless record. Sweetheart, they will not look twice at you. You would be saving your sister. You would be saving this family." They wanted me to willingly sign a confession to a federal crime to insulate their favorite child. I let the silence hang in the air for exactly 30 seconds. I reached into the pocket of my blazer, my fingers brushing against the small, active digital audio recorder Nora had equipped me with earlier that afternoon. Ohio is a one-party consent state, meaning I possess the absolute legal right to record every single word of their confession. I pulled my cell phone out, unlocked the screen, and sent a pre-written text message to Nora that contained a single word: execute. Across town, at that exact second, Nora's private digital forensics team walked through the front doors of Larkhaven Reproductive Center with a court-authorized preservation order. They immediately locked down the administrative servers, physical file cabinets, and internal network drives, backing up every single byte of data before Reagan's loyal staff could delete the remaining evidence. I locked my phone, placed it face down on the table, and looked up at my parents, the mask of the exhausted. Compliant daughter vanished entirely. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a thick, legally bound document stamped with the county clerk's seal, and dropped it heavily onto the forged insurance claims they wanted me to sign. "What is this?" Grant asked, his brow furrowing as he stared at the legal seal. "That is a sworn, notarized affidavit," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth, echoing against the walls of the den like striking steel. "I filed it with the civil court at 8 o'clock this morning. In it, I categorically deny all consent regarding those medical procedures. I have provided the court with my corporate travel logs, the digital timestamp chain from Reagan's internal computer, and the direct correspondence with my former healthcare provider. It explicitly details exactly how my medical identity was stolen to facilitate insurance fraud." The color drained from Grant's face so rapidly, he looked physically ill. Judith froze, her hand hovering over her chest. The realization of the trap finally dawned on them, hitting them with the force of a freight train. "You set us up," Grant roared, his voice trembling with a sudden, violent rage as he shot to his feet. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You walked in here and lied to us." "I learned from the absolute best," I replied coldly, leaning back in the armchair. Judith instantly burst into tears, realizing that manipulation through authority had failed. She switched immediately to her secondary weapon, vicious, unhinged guilt. "You are a cold-blooded monster," Judith shrieked, her face twisting into an ugly mask of hatred. "You are completely selfish and ungrateful. We raised you. We gave you everything. And you come back here just to destroy your own blood. You have always been jealous of Reagan. You are vindictive, and you are willing to let your own family burn just to satisfy your pathetic ego." It was the exact same venomous language they had used my entire life whenever I refused to silently clean up the wreckage they created. But tonight, the words held absolutely no power over me. They sounded like the desperate, pathetic thrashing of trapped animals. Before Judith could launch into another hysterical tirade, the heavy front door of the house clicked open. Willa walked into the den. She did not look terrified anymore. She looked remarkably steady. She carried the heavy metal lockbox from the bridal studio, the one containing the donor contracts and the damning audio recording of Grant plotting to use me as a human shield. Willa walked directly past my stunned parents and placed the box on the coffee table right next to my affidavit. "I am completely done playing your games, Grant," Willa said, her voice ringing with a newfound, desperate courage. "I am done being a human shield for Reagan, and I am done letting you hold my daughter over Chloe's head. Tomorrow morning, at the emergency injunction hearing, I am taking the stand. I am handing over every single piece of evidence in this box. I am going to confess to my part in the fraud, and I am going to testify exactly how this family orchestrated the rest of it." Grant staggered backward, collapsing heavily onto the sofa. The two women they had perfectly controlled, manipulated, and pitted against each other had just closed the jaws of the trap around them simultaneously, to completely sever their final desperate lifeline. I placed one more document on the table. "Do not ever accuse me of abandoning that child," I told my mother, tapping the final piece of paper. "This is a formal petition filed with the probate court. When the state medical board revokes Reagan's license and Larkhaven is forced into receivership, I am legally requesting that a percentage of the liquidated commercial assets be placed into a strict independent financial oversight trust for Maisie. She will have a fully funded education, guaranteed housing, and top-tier health care. I am ensuring the child is completely protected from the absolute ruin you are all about to face." I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. "I told you I would not make myself a replacement parent. I am not stepping in to save you. I am simply dismantling the house you built on my back." I turned and walked out of the house, leaving them sitting in the suffocating silence of their own destruction. I returned to my hotel suite downtown, poured a glass of sparkling water, and sat by the window. My phone rang just after 10 o'clock. It was Nora. Her voice crackled over the speaker with a mixture of disbelief and sharp anticipation. "I just received a call from the hospital administration," Nora reported. "Reagan woke up an hour ago. She is completely conscious, fully coherent, and demanding to speak to her legal counsel." For a brief fraction of a second, the old conditioned instinct to panic flared in my chest. The golden child was awake. The master manipulator was back on the board. But then, a slow, deep sense of absolute satisfaction settled over me. Reagan waking up the night before the emergency hearing was not a disaster. It was the ultimate, perfect gift. If she had remained in a coma, she would have been a silent, tragic martyr in the eyes of the court. But Reagan was awake. She was a woman who had spent her entire life winning every battle with her arrogant, commanding voice. She would walk into that hearing tomorrow firmly believing she still controlled the narrative. She would try to lie, manipulate, and charm her way out of the consequences. Completely unaware that I held the detonator to the explosive charges planted directly beneath her feet. She was going to destroy herself on the public record. I sat in the quiet hotel room, looking out through the thick glass at the glittering lights of the old city. I was entirely at peace. Tomorrow morning was not just a legal hearing regarding a medical clinic. Tomorrow was the exact moment my family permanently lost the right to write my history. The emergency injunction hearing did not take place in a cozy mediator's office or a quiet family living room. It unfolded inside a sprawling, sterile conference room on the 42nd floor of a downtown federal courthouse. It was a brutal, fluorescent-lit collision of medical ethics, corporate finance, and family dysfunction. The scandal had vastly outgrown the boundaries of a private domestic dispute. Representatives from the State Medical Licensing Board sat rigidly on one side of the massive mahogany table, a team of severe-looking risk assessment bankers, the people holding the primary loans for the clinic, occupied the opposite end, civil litigators, stenographers, and compliance auditors filled the remaining leather chairs. The air in the room was incredibly heavy, thick with the undeniable scent of an empire seconds away from total collapse. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the large digital monitor mounted at the head of the table flickered to life. A video feed connected directly to the intensive care unit at the state hospital illuminated the screen. Reagan appeared. She looked pale, her face bruised and her hospital gown stark against the white pillows. But the near-fatal car wreck had not managed to kill her arrogance. She stared into the camera lens with the same venomous, controlling superiority she had wielded our entire lives, even from a hospital bed. She desperately tried to direct the narrative. This entire investigation is a massive, vindictive witch hunt, Reagan declared, her voice raspy but dripping with practiced conviction. She looked directly at the medical board representatives, entirely ignoring me. My sister, Chloe, was fully aware of the family planning timeline. She knew about the donor. She initially consented to the entire reproductive process 5 years ago, but when she experienced a sudden crisis of commitment and walked away from the wedding, she became deeply, obsessively jealous of the life Willa and I were building. She is simply weaponizing her old corporate insurance details now to exact a petty, emotional revenge against my clinic. Before the echo of her lie could even settle in the room, Judith immediately leaned forward into her microphone, nodding vigorously. "It is the absolute truth," my mother testified, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured maternal sorrow. "Chloe has always struggled with severe jealousy regarding her older sister. We have tried to handle this tragic emotional misunderstanding privately, to protect her, but she refuses to let go of her bitterness." Grant sat beside her, folding his hands on the table, attempting to project the image of a weary, reasonable patriarch. "This is a family dispute over a broken engagement that has sadly spilled over into administrative paperwork," he added smoothly, looking toward the bankers. "We simply ask that you do not let one daughter's emotional instability destroy a vital medical institution." They truly believed that was all it would take. They genuinely thought that if they just painted me as a hysterical, jilted lover, the men in expensive suits would dismiss the entire fraud as female hysteria and close their briefcases. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my emotional stability. I did not even look at the video screen where my sister was watching me. I simply nodded to Nora Bell. Nora stood up, unclasped her leather briefcase, and began dropping the absolute, undeniable truth onto the oak table, piece by piece. "The claimant will not be arguing emotions today," Nora stated, her voice slicing through the boardroom like a scalpel. "We will strictly argue geography, timestamps, and digital forensics." Nora distributed the thick packets of evidence to the medical board and the bankers. "Exhibit A," she announced. "These are the certified, notarized corporate travel logs and commercial flight manifests, proving my client was over 400 miles away in North Carolina at the exact minute the electronic consent form was generated from Dr. Robinson's private office. Exhibit B is the digital access log proving Dr. Robinson's personal credentials were used to override the insurance billing software. Exhibit C is the formal, intercepted correspondence." Nora placed the yellowed handwritten letter and the recovered email server logs in front of the board. "These prove my client was systematically kept completely ignorant of the situation by the very parents claiming she orchestrated this revenge." The room grew terrifyingly quiet. The banker stopped taking notes and began staring blankly at the documents. Grant's confident posture completely collapsed, his shoulders sinking as he stared at the flight manifests. "But the most compelling evidence," Nora continued, her tone relentless, "is Exhibit D, the recovered security footage from Larkhaven Reproductive Center, cross-referenced with the physical intake forms." Nora pressed a button on her remote, overriding the secondary screen next to Reagan's live feed. A silent, black and white security video played for the room. It showed Willa sitting at the front reception desk 5 years ago, signing a stack of papers. The camera angle clearly captured the primary document. The secondary partner line was completely blank when Willa handed it back to the receptionist. Nora then displayed the final, submitted version of that exact same document pulled from the federal discovery file. My forged signature was glaringly present in black ink, before the opposing counsel could even attempt to object. Willa stood up from her chair at the back of the room. She did not look at Reagan on the monitor. She looked directly at the state medical investigators. "I signed those papers," Willa said, her voice echoing clearly across the silent boardroom. "I participated in the affair. I betrayed Chloe, but I will not perjure myself to protect this corrupt institution for another single second." Reagan manipulated the entire timeline. She utilized the clinic's internal accounts to completely conceal the financial footprint of our relationship. And Grant and Judith Robinson actively aided in covering it up by intercepting my letters and leveraging $250,000 in hush money. I will provide full testimony to the federal prosecutors. The resulting implosion was instantaneous. Within the span of a single morning, the mighty Robinson dynasty was entirely eradicated. The lead banker pulled out his phone, walked to the corner of the room, and immediately initiated the protocols to call in all outstanding commercial loans, effectively bankrupting the clinic. The state medical board representative formally announced the immediate, temporary suspension of Reagan's medical license pending a full criminal inquiry. Larkhaven's operating assets were completely frozen. The civil liability for the forged insurance claims was officially shifted away from me and placed squarely onto Reagan, Willa, and my parents, pushing their respective fates deep into the criminal litigation phase, in a last desperate attempt to salvage the wreckage. The lead defense attorney representing my parents approached me during the recess. He looked incredibly sweaty. His previous arrogance entirely evaporated. "Ms. Robinson," the lawyer whispered frantically, leaning over the table, "if you agree to a non-disclosure settlement and formally take over the interim directorship of Larkhaven today, your parents are willing to sign over 100% of their voting shares and their entire estate inheritance to you. You would have total control. You can save your family's legacy and walk away a very wealthy woman." I looked at the sweating lawyer, then looked past him to where Grant and Judith were sitting, their faces pale, watching me with desperate, terrified eyes. They were offering me the throne of a burning kingdom. "I do not want your clinic," I replied, my voice ringing with absolute, chilling finality. "I do not want your money. I am not stepping in to replace Reagan. I am not repairing this broken bloodline. And I am absolutely not absorbing the consequences of their actions. The only legal motion I will authorize today is the establishment of the independent trust." I turned to the probate judge who had joined the hearing. "I demand that from the eventual liquidation of the Larkhaven commercial assets, a protected, heavily supervised financial trust be established exclusively for the 4-year-old child, Maisie. It will cover her educational tuition, necessary pediatric therapy, and stable housing costs until she is 21 years of age. Neither Willa Mercer, Reagan Robinson, nor my parents will have any administrative access to those funds. I am securing the child's future without ever making myself her surrogate mother or a permanent lifeboat for these adults." The judge nodded, immediately stamping the petition. It was over. I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on the monitor where Reagan was screaming silently into a muted microphone, and walked down the long center aisle of the boardroom. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped out into the brightly lit marble hallway. Tessa was waiting for me near the elevators. She did not ask how it went. She simply looked at the absolute peace radiating from my face, smiled, and reached out to take my hand. As the elevator doors closed, taking us down to the street level, the profound irony of the entire situation finally settled over me. My family had dragged me back to this city because they genuinely believed I was their final, reliable emergency exit. They had assumed my empathy was a weakness they could easily exploit one last time. They simply never expected that the person they summoned back would be the exact witness completely lucid enough to slam the heavy iron door shut behind them, locking them inside their own burning house forever. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel. Leave a like on this video. And support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people around the world.